Alrighty, so let's go over a quick, brief week 3 lecture quiz review. So we'll touch on muscles, right? Muscle anatomy, also talk about some axial and appendicular muscles, right? So remember there's going to be 3 types of muscle tissue, right? There's going to be skeletal muscles. These skeletal muscles, we have conscious voluntary control over these, right? So these skeletal muscles will be able to pull on skeletal bones to produce movement. We have cardiac muscles. Um, this is gonna be found in your heart, right? And so this is gonna be able to push blood through your arteries and your veins. It's gonna be rhythmically contracting, but this is involuntary, right? Involuntary contraction. So we don't have conscious control over this, nor do we have conscious control over smooth muscle, right? So smooth muscle, examples of smooth muscle, you're gonna find this in the inside of your digestive tract because it's going to be able to push fluids and solids along your digestive tract, right? So that's going to be smooth muscle. And again, involuntary contraction. Now, remember the functions of skeletal muscles, right? Again, it's going to be able to pull on tendons to move a bone to produce movement. It's going to help to maintain posture and body position. It's going to also help to stabilize and support the weight of your visceral organs. And it regulates the entering and exiting of material, right? So we have voluntary control over swallowing, defecating, urination, things like that, because we're going to have these sphincter muscles, and they're going to encircle orifices of like your digestive tract and your urinary tract. And also skeletal muscles will be able to maintain body temperature, right? So some of that energy that's used for contraction is going to be converted to heat, okay? Remember the different types of connective tissues that surround muscle, right? So we have the epimysium. The epimysium is going to be this layer of connective tissue that surrounds the entire muscle organ, right? Then we have the perimysium, and that's going to be a layer of connective tissue that will surround a muscle fascicle. And then you have the endomysium. The endomysium is going to be that layer of connective tissue that surrounds an individual muscle cell, okay? So remember that whole muscle, right, is going to be broken up into many muscle fascicles, and a muscle fascicle is just a bundle of muscle cells. So you take one of these out right here that I'm circling, and you get right there. That's a muscle fascicle. And so you take one of these cells out right here that I circled, you get it right there. That's a muscle cell or muscle fiber. But again, remember, the epimysium will be the connective tissue that surrounds the entire muscle. Then we have the perimysium, right? The perimysium will be the connective tissue that surrounds a muscle fascicle. And then we have the endomysium. The endomysium will be that connective tissue that surrounds the individual muscle fiber or the individual muscle cell, okay? And so I like this little breakdown right here because we go down from microscopic to microscopic. So that entire skeletal muscle will be composed of many, many muscle fascicles. Muscle fascicles are just bundles of muscle cells. And so you take one of those cells out and you have the muscle cell or the muscle fiber. You see these red dots that's in there? Those are myofibrils, okay? So we can look at these myofibrils, and what makes up these myofibrils are these sarcomeres. So it's like 10,000 or so sarcomeres per myofibril, so per red dot that we see in there. And it's these sarcomeres that are going to be the contractile unit of the muscle. So this is where the contraction is going to happen. So let's look at the sarcomere. So this is a sarcomere. You got to understand the organization of a sarcomere. The sarcomere will be from Z disc or Z line that I'm drawing right now to Z disc. All right? So Z disc to Z disc, that is one sarcomere. Okay, so the ends are the Z's, the Z disc. So think of the end of the alphabet as Z. So that's one end and the other end, right, of the sarcomere. Okay, then you have inside the sarcomere, you have this I band that I'm drawing in right here, right? The I band only consists of actin. That's the thin filament. Okay, you have this A band right here, right? And that's going to consist of both thin and thick filament. So when you look at this band, right, I'm going to outline the top of it. You see purple and you see red in there, right? The purple, right, that's going to be myosin. That's the thick filament. But the red, that's actin. So that's why you have them overlapping each other at this zone of overlap, right? And so that's where that cross bridging is going to occur. But notice how in that H band right here, notice how there's no red in there. It's only blue. Or purple, I should say. It's only purple. So the H band only consists of myosin. And again, myosin is the thick filament. Okay, so remember that. And within that H band, you see the middle of the H band. That's that M line. So think of M as in middle, right? M as in middle. So it's the middle of the H band. Okay. So for your skeletal muscles to contract, it's going to be that motor neuron that you see right here. It's going to innervate this muscle, right? That just means this muscle will have a neuron coming to it. That's what we mean by innervate, right? And so this motor neuron will release acetylcholine, right, at this axon terminal, okay? At that axon terminal, we will release acetylcholine. And so acetylcholine is simply a neurotransmitter, okay? It's a neurotransmitter, okay? That's going to initiate the skeletal muscle to contract. And so if we look at this image right here, right, acetylcholine is going to be in these synaptic vesicles. So look at this synaptic vesicle. It's just a vesicle, is a membrane-bound sac that holds something. So it's holding this neurotransmitter until it needs to be released, until you tell, right, that muscle to contract. So this neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, right, will get released into this synaptic cleft space, right? When acetylcholine gets released into that synaptic cleft space, it only has like a few milliseconds, right? Or half a millisecond rather. And it has to bind here. It has to bind here, right? Bind here at these acetylcholine receptors. And so that can initiate the beginning of this muscle contraction. Now remember, I said it only has about a half a millisecond in that synaptic cleft space. And so what we have also in that synaptic cleft space is this ACHE molecule. This is acetylcholine esterase, right? This is an enzyme that's going to be in the synaptic cleft space that breaks down acetylcholine, that's stopping that muscle from contracting, right? So in order to start a muscle to contract, we have to release acetylcholine, that neurotransmitter. In order to stop a muscle from contracting, we need to release acetylcholine esterase, right? And that's going to break down the acetylcholine that's stopping the muscle contraction. And so when we're looking a little bit deeper within that muscle cell, right, you see this blue structure? We talked about that blue structure, right? This blue structure is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum, right? And it's similar to that endoplasmic reticulum, right? So remember, it's just in the word, right? Similar to that smooth endoplasmic reticulum that we find in our cells, right? But the function of that sarcoplasmic reticulum is going to be to store calcium ions, right? So this is where you're going to be able to store calcium ions, because that calcium ion is going to be required and needed for the muscle to contract, right? Of course, acetylcholine starts or initiates that muscle to contract, but it's calcium that also helps and allows this muscle to contract, okay? And let me just go back for just a second. And so we gotta remember, right, the structure of that actin. And I'm just going to talk about it for a second. You can look inside your book while I'm talking about it, right? And so remember, when we're looking at that F-actin strand, that actin, or that thin filament, is made up of a couple of different proteins, right? Being that nebulin, that's going to be in the center, that blue one that's going to be in the center, it literally holds this strand together. It holds all these proteins together. That makes up this one protein, which is actin. And so we have the nebulin, we have the G-actin globular proteins, right? Those little orange balls, right? And they're going to have like an active site on them. And that active site is going to be blocked by tropomyosin. And you have another protein called troponin that holds tropomyosin in place. And so myosin, the thick filament, needs to bind to actin, specifically that active site. But it can't, because the active site is blocked. So we have to remove tropomyosin out of the way. In order to remove tropomyosin out of the way, we need to remove troponin. So it's the calcium that comes from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, right, that binds to the troponin. Troponin then undergoes a conformational change. Basically, it moves out of the way, thus pulling myosin or tropomyosin out of the way. Now those active sites are not exposed. So myosin and actin can now form that cross bridge. They can touch each other, essentially, okay? So remember, it's a motor unit, right, that controls these muscle fibers. So all the muscle fibers, right, that are controlled by a single motor neuron, that makes up a motor unit, right? So you have precise control if a motor unit is controlling 2 or 3 muscle fibers, right? So that's like control over your eye muscles. Notice how it's one motor unit controlling just 2 or 3 muscle fibers, right? That's precise control. But if you have a motor unit that's controlling like 2,000 muscle fibers, then you have simply less control, right? So when you have a single motor neuron that's controlling this large number of muscle fibers, you're going to be less precise with your control, right? Now, remember, there's axial and appendicular musculature. And so the axial musculature is going to be the muscles that position the head in the vertebral column and the muscles that move the rib cage. Appendicular musculature is going to be the muscles that stabilize or move the appendicular skeleton. And so we remember this because we can think of it as, remember, the skeletal system, right, was divided into axial and appendicular, just like how the muscular system is as well, right? So it's kind of similar to that skeletal system, okay? Now, when we're looking at some axial musculature, right, remember the muscles of facial expression, okay? Write these down, okay? So these muscles of facial expression, right, they're going to be divided into 5 groups, right? The mouth, the eyes, scalp, nose, and neck. But I note on here some of those, or these muscles right here, right? Now, all of these muscles are going to be innervated by that cranial nerve number 7, okay? And so we have, for example, the orbicularis oris. Oris means mouth, okay? Don't get it confused with orbicularis oculi right here, right? Oculi means eye, right? So you have these circular muscles, some around your lips, right? The orbicularis oris, and then you have orbicularis oculi around your ocula, or your eyes, rather, okay? And so you can just think of like the HoloLens, like an Oculus device, that they have out in the market. You put that over your eye. So Oculus, oculi means eye, okay? Oris means oral or mouth, okay? So the orbicularis oris will constrict the opening of the mouth, right? You also have that large plazisma muscle right there. That's also a muscle of facial expression, right? And that's going to cover the anterior surface of the neck. And it's basically going to extend from the base of the neck, right, to the periosteum of that mandible and the fascia and the corner of the mouth, as you can kind of see right there, right? But again, all of these muscles of facial expression, they're going to be innervated by cranial nerve number 7, right? That facial nerve, okay? That facial nerve, okay? So now, when we're looking at some of these, I also want you to look at that occipitofrontalis muscle, right? So you have a front belly and a back belly. The back belly is going to be over the occipital bone, basically. That's why it's called the occipitofrontalis, right? Now, again, remember this, it's going to have a frontal belly and an occipital belly that's going to be separated by the collagenous epicranial aponeurosis. And that aponeurosis kind of looks like a tendon, right? But you got to think about it. A tendon is a cord-like sheet of connective tissue, whereas an aponeurosis is a flat sheet of connective tissue, right? And let me go back for just a second, right? Because I didn't explain a tendon. Now let me just explain it. So you see this tendon right here? That tendon is formed from where epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium. These connective tissues, they all merge together at the end of this muscle, forming that tendon, okay? That's how you form a tendon. All these connective tissues, they merge together to form that tendon to attach this muscle to the bone, okay? But again, a tendon is a cord-like sheet of connective tissue, whereas that we see right here, this aponeurosis is a flat sheet of connective tissue, right? But again, this occipitofrontalis muscle is going to have a frontal belly over the frontal bone and an occipital belly over the occipital bone, and is going to be separated by collagenous epicranial aponeurosis. Now, let's look at that buccinator for a second, right? You have all these muscles, right, in the face, right? But I'm going to focus on just a few for now, right? Look at that buccinator. That buccinator is going to be right there, right? And so that buccinator is going to have 2 functions related to feeding, right? It's going to be able to move food back across the teeth right, from that space inside your cheek, right, to get it out of that crevice, basically. And in infants, right, this buccinator is going to be really important because it's going to be responsible for producing the suction required for suckling at the breast, right, so baby can drink, so baby can eat, okay? So remember that about that buccinator. Remember these muscles, okay? And so those muscles of mastication, right? So we see that large masseter, right? You got the masseter, you got the temporalis, right? You got these pterygoid muscles, right? And so these muscles, right, they're going to often insert on the mandible, right? Remember that. These muscles of mastication, they're going to often insert on the mandible, okay? It's going to be strong muscles, really, that helps you to chew, right? So look at the muscles of the vertebral column. And so remember that we're going to have this intermediate layer that's going to be in the intrinsic back muscle. So you're going to have a capita. These muscles are going to insert on the skull. The cervices, these are going to insert on the upper cervical vertebrae. And the thoracic muscles, these are going to insert on the lower cervical and upper thoracic vertebrae. But I want you to also remember these erector spinae muscles, right? These are a group of 3 muscles, right? These are a group of 3 muscles. And so you have the iliocostalis, the longissimus, and these spinalis muscles. And these spinalis muscles that you can see, look, they're like in the middle, right? They're most medial, right? Spinalis, right? Cervices, the spinalis, thoraces. These are medial, whereas the iliocostalis muscles, right? These are most lateral, right? So remember those spinalis muscles, they're like basically on the spine and the middle, the most medial portion, right? So remember that, okay? Now, the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles, those are important, especially for respiration, for breathing, right? So that diaphragm, we talk about that all the time, right? And so we talk about the diaphragm because it's going to be able to separate the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity, okay? Remember that about the diaphragm. It's going to separate the thoracic from the abdominal pelvic cavity, and it's going to be innervated by that phrenic nerve. Now, we also have other muscles, such as those internal intercostal muscles, and we'll talk about these a little bit more, too, when we look at respiration. But these internal intercostal muscles, they're going to help with respiration, so breathing. And what they're going to do is they're going to depress the ribs, right? They're going to depress the ribs, okay? So remember that. So when we're looking at the muscles of the back, so we talked about those intrinsic muscles of the back, right? Also look at these extrinsic muscles of the back too, right? Like such as that large diamond shape muscle of the upper back. That's going to be the trapezius, right? So remember the trapezius is going to be this diamond shaped muscle of the upper back, and it's going to cover most of the upper back, as you can see. It's going to insert on the clavicle and the scapular spines, right? And it's going to extend from the base of the skull, right, down to the middle of the back. Okay, so remember that about the trapezius is able to also rotate the scapula. Okay, this is going to be one of those muscles that help to rotate the scapula. Okay. Now, the muscles of the rotator cuff. Now, remember these because, especially when you start to practice, right, different type of injuries could occur to the rotator cuff. So, like sports players, whether you're playing football or you're playing tennis, you know, racket sports or golf or any type of sport really that you're in using your arm and your shoulder. Remember, you have a lot of range of motion in your shoulder, right, in that joint, in that glenohumeral joint. But, you know, you do risk the chance of having higher amounts of injuries too because of that. And it's these muscles of the rotator cuff that typically will get injured sometimes, right? It's easy to tear them, especially as you get older. Now, remember the muscles of the rotator cuff. I call them these TIS muscles, right? Or you can say the sit muscles, right? You can just do it backwards, right? However you want to remember them, right? If we use TIS muscles, right, it's going to be the teres minor, infraspinatus, supraspinatus, and the subscapularis. These are the muscles of the rotator cuff. Okay, so remember that. Remember the muscles of the pectoral girdle and the upper limb. So these extensor muscles that you can see, they're going to help to extend and adduct or abduct at the wrists. Okay, these extensor muscles are the upper limb. They're going to be innervated by that radial nerve. Okay, they're going to be innervated by that radial nerve. Okay, so remember that. And when we're looking at muscles that move the leg, so we have these knee extensors or extensors of the knee. These are going to be their quadriceps. Now, these quadriceps muscles, right? These are going to be these vastus muscles plus the rectus femoris. So the vastus intermedius, vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, and rectus femoris. So these three vastus muscles, right, plus the rectus femoris, right? Remember, these are extensors of the knee, okay? These are going to be innervated by the femoral nerve, okay? They're right over the femur bone, right? So it makes sense, right? These are going to be innervated by the femur bone. And so these muscles that we can see, like I mentioned, these vastus muscles, these rectus muscles, they're going to be innervated by the femoral nerve, as well as this pectineus muscle, right? This pectineus muscle right here, right, is also going to be innervated, right, by that femoral nerve. And so we also have adductors, right? So the adductor group, right? The muscles that help to move the thigh, right? So you're going to find the gracilis muscle, right? The adductor brevis, adductor longus, magnus, and this pectineus muscle, right? These are all going to be adductor muscles of the thigh. Remember them. So you had extensors of the knee, and now you're looking at flexors of the knee. So these flexors that will help to flex your leg, right, at the knee, these are your hamstrings, right? So these are going to basically be on the posterior side of your leg, on the back of your leg, right? The back of your thigh, I should say, right? So these muscles are going to help to flex the knee, and these are going to be your hamstring muscles, okay? These, excuse me, these hamstring muscles are going to be, right, remember these, the semitendinosus, semimembranosus, the biceps femoris, right? Remember, these are flexors of the knee, those hamstring muscles, right? Remember, these are those hamstring muscles, okay? Semitendinosus, semimembranosus, and biceps femoris, okay? Happy study.